Hello BookTube, I'm going to do another tag. Now, apologies to all the people who tagged me in lovely tags in the autumn and winter that I completely failed to do because I wasn't 100% well. But perversely, today I'm going to do a tag that I've just seen that's a brand new one that just kind of caught my fancy. And because almost that backlog is almost too challenging to contemplate. So this is the birth year book tag. It was started a week ago by Criminoli, who's a splendid booktuber who I don't really watch because the things he reads aren't really my cup of tea, but he's in himself delightful. And I saw a couple of versions of this already, one by Jason Harrigan that really sort of, made me want to do it. So it's about books from when you were born or when you were 18. And the first prompt is, have you read any books published in the year you were born? And the answer is yes, quite a few. I was born in 1964, and it asks your favourite book from that year and why. Now, my favourite book from that year was written and published in Brazil that year. I didn't read an English translation of it until relatively recently. That book is The Passion According to G.H. by Clarice Lispector, and I'm passionate about Lispector, as you'll know if you've hung around this channel any length of time, and so it's 100% has to be my favourite of the year, even though I came to it so much later. Kindly though, this prompt does allow you to say, do you have any other favourites from that year? And I do. One is an English novel by William Golding called The Spire, which I must have read sometime in the 1980s, but it's still lodged in my head. I'll probably have to reread it sometime, won't I? It's lodged in my head because it is a very intense novel about building a spire on an English cathedral and the kind of obsessive goal of doing something that's almost beyond what was then technological capability. Excellent book. The other favourite from 1964 I'm going to mention is a completely different genre, and that's From Dune with Death by Ruth Rendell. Now, I don't know if you know Ruth Rendell, but she was a sort of very successful British woman crime writer of the second half of the 20th century, and From Dune with Death was her the first book in which she introduced her popular detective hero, Inspector Wexford. So it's the first of the Wexford books, and yes, it's got a little affectionate place in my heart, that one. But probably the sort of almost might have been my favourite for the year if it hadn't been for that Lispector wrote a book that year, is a book of poetry, and that's The Whitson Weddings by Philip Larkin. Philip Larkin was a miserable librarian from Hull in the north of England who wrote some superb poetry, not always likeable, but always brilliant. And that's a book of which I'm very, very fond. I'm also going to tell you my least favourite book of 1964, and that's Herzog by Saul Bellow. But in some ways I'm grateful to Herzog by Saul Bellow, because I think reading that was one of the things that made me realise that I didn't have to pretend that I like the books of that generation of American male writers. I think I've heard them called on BookTube, by women on BookTube, the mid-century misogynists, and I don't have to go there anymore. Not that it's a bad book, it is actually a good book. I just don't need to read it. There we go. Third bit of that initial prompt is to say that if you haven't read a book from the year of your birth, that you could pledge to do so, but I have, so that's irrelevant. Prompt number 2. Okay. Have you read any books published in the year you turned 18? That's a great question. So I turned 18 in 1982. Yes, I've read quite a number of books, I think, from 1982. Um, a few that I'm going to mention. One of which I've definitely read, if not in the year itself, very close to, was The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. This is the women's press fiction edition that came out so in the mid 80s, but I think I'd already read it, but I wanted to own it because it was such a had such an impact on me as a book. I hadn't read a lot by like Black American women writers at that point, and it really struck a chord. Although I think maybe looking back at it now, I might find it slightly, if I say sentimental, that's perhaps not fair, but I don't know. Yeah, if you've read it recently, tell me what you think. Now, I've read a couple of other sort of books from 1982 by Black American writers much more recently. One would be Zammy, A New Spelling of My Name by Audre Lorde, which I read just about a year or so ago. One of those books that, although I didn't like every part of it, had quite a profound impact on me, I suppose. It's that thing about understanding, standing in somebody else's shoes, and I felt like Audre Lorde allowed me to do that in that, because it is a memoir of her sort of youth and coming of age and coming out and finding herself, I suppose. Another, though, that was tremendous fun was Ma Rainey's Black Bottom by August Wilson. It's a play that I read this time last year for American Black History Month, and such a really enjoyable play, and I read it before watching the film. Yeah, if you haven't, do maybe go for the film, but I mean, do read the play because it's a fine play. So that's a couple of things from 1982. Oh, another one that I meant to mention was Becca Lamb by Zoe Edgell, which is a book from Belize, which is one of those books that I read because of my Read Around the World, Scallydandling Challenge, and actually turned out to be a really good coming of age novel that I would recommend to anyone. But none of those books are my favourite, I would say. My favourite book of 1982 was one that is almost, I felt I had to pick it as my favourite because it almost defines the reader that I was in the mid 80s, and that's In the House of Spirits by Isabella Allende. So Allende was, I think, born in Peru but is Chilean, and then had to leave because of the politics there of in her childhood. And The House of Spirits was written almost as a tribute to her family and their history, but it's a novel, and it was one of those books that first got me, I suppose, reading novels, literature from outside, I don't know, Northern Europe and North America. I absolutely loved Allende in the 1980s. I mean, not that I dislike her now, but I just read everything that she wrote, everything that came out translated into English at that time. I think this was translated into English about 1985, and that would be around the time that I read it. But I'm going to give an honourable mention to the one book that was first published in 1982 that I'm absolutely sure I read in 1982 itself. And it's a book of non-fiction, and you may smile, but it was The Rough Guide to Greece. Now, if you're a traveller, you'll know the Rough Guides. The Rough Guide to Greece came out in 1982, was the very first Rough Guide to be published. And I bought it, and I took it in my backpack, and I went by train with that book interrailing in Europe and to Greece, and it was like my Bible for Greek island hopping and exploring and finding cheap place to stay in Athens and go to. So a very fond memory, although not exactly literature. There we go. Now, question number 3 is, of the last 10 books you've read, how many were published before you were born? Okay, so 4 out of the last 10. And then it says, what are they? And do you prefer them to the newer books? Well, that's a bit of a funny question. No, I don't think, I like old books, new books, any books, but what were they? Okay, so one was, we'll do them in order of publication. Okay, so the first was 6 Characters in Search of an Author by Luigi Pirandello, play I read, which was published in 1921, in Italian, obviously translated subsequently. Published in 1925 was Shaka by Thomas Mafolo, which is an author from Lesotho. 1931, and very redolent of his era, was Going to the Dogs by Eric Castner. Splendid book that I would strongly recommend to any reader. Just don't expect it to be like his children's book Emily and the Detectives. It's definitely an adult book. Now, what was the next? What was the fourth? The fourth was the best, probably the best book I've of all these 10, and the best book I've read in the last sort of month or so, and that was Mehmed My Hawk by Yasha Kemal. That came out in 1955. It is a classic of 20th century Turkish writing, and I've got a whole video about it that I made with Berna of Berna's Bookish Adventures, because she read it in Turkish and I read it in English, and it was great. But I'm going to give an honourable mention to the 11th book going back that I read, because that came out in 19 what am I talking about, towards the end of 2021, so it's a brand new book, but it's actually a book from the 12th century, and that's The Owl and the Nightingale, and this is a sort of a retelling or translation from the Middle English by Simon Armitage of a anonymous 12th century poem. So, that's definitely from before I was born, 12th century, isn't it? There we go. Now, question number 4. We're moving on to films here. Now, first thing I need to say is that I don't have the same passion about films that I have about books. I know that it's because I don't approach them with the same attention that I give a book, and I know that films can be approached with that sort of attention, but for me they're more, they're more ephemeral than books are. But that actually made it a really interesting exercise to have to look up what came out in the year I was born, 1964. So I had to say, what's my favourite film from that year and why? And actually, there are lots of films I've seen from 1964, and some repeatedly and with great pleasure. A good example would be The Pink Panther with Peter Sellers. Really funny film that used to seem to be on every other week on a wet Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon. My Fair Lady is another one, a good example of 1964 film that I've probably seen multiple times, because it was just endlessly on the telly. But my favourite, well, I was tempted at first to pick Zorba the Greek, but then I realised that it has to be A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles film. It's such a brilliant film. It's funny. The music in it obviously is superb. The Beatles play themselves very effectively. It's kind of, it has a sort of almost fantasia quality to it. Really, definitely my favourite from 1964. Prompt number 5, logically, is your favourite film from the year you were 18 and why? Okay, and 1982, there is only one possible film to pick as my favourite, I think, and it just has to be Blade Runner. Not perhaps because I don't know that it was my favourite film then, if you know what I mean. But just because it's like some sort of, I don't know, it's like a cultural watershed in film terms, isn't it? You know, and we've had the multiple different versions of it since, and it just was so influential. So it had to be that. But a very close second, and probably more representative of the Ros who watched films in 1982 and the kind of films that I enjoyed at the time, okay, is a film called The Draftsman's Contract, which you will know if you're a film buff and possibly not otherwise. It was written and directed by Peter Greenaway. So he's a British film director. It's words. So it's set in a historical setting. The place where it's actually filmed, the location is an old house and garden, quite not that far from here and not that far from where I grew up, Groombridge Place, on the borders of Kent and Sussex. It's how can I say it? The reason I love it is it has the most extraordinary visual quality. It's an odd film, and you know, it's a film that's like the kind of books that I enjoy, where you don't quite know what's going on. There's subtext, and it also has the most amazing soundtrack by Michael Nyman's, and yeah, it's yeah. So perhaps that's my favourite. Oh. What's the film I've seen most frequently from 1982? Without doubt, The Snowman. So it's an animated film of the book by Raymond Briggs. If you haven't seen it, it's adorable, and I think I must have seen it every Christmas since 1982. So, you know, that's definitely the most frequent. Now, the final thing you're asked to do is to tag people, obviously, but to tag the same number of people as the years that you have lived. So, who am I going to tag? I would tag Sean the Book Maniac, but I don't think he's doing tags at the moment, so I'm gonna leave him off unless he fancies it. I'm going to tag Berna of Berna's Bookish Adventures because I mentioned her in the video. I'm going to tag Kim of Middle of the Book March because she's not as old as me, but she's been around long enough to have different and interesting book birth years and years she was 18 to talk about. I'm going to tag Mark Nash because I know he's perhaps more my sort of generation, and I know he likes a good tag. He'll probably have done it before the end of Tuesday. I'm going to tag someone much younger than me, which is Fraser Simons, whose videos I'm really enjoying at the moment, and likewise Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, because that's a 2-for-1 whammy, isn't it? They'll have 2 different birth years and 2 different years they were 18, because I'm pretty sure they're not exactly the same age. That's Scott and Nell, of course. And so that's my 5, except I mentioned Sean's, which is cheating. And I'm going to throw an extra one in at the end, which is Alan of Big Hard Books and Classics, because Alan always tells me off if I don't tag him. There we go. But anyone else who fancies it, because it's a great tag.